You're listening to the Modern People Leader podcast, where we go behind the scenes with today's top HR leaders and work experts. We talk to them about how they've gotten to where they're at, what they do every day, and what they see coming next for the future of work. Hope you enjoy.
Brian, welcome to the Modern People Leader.
Oh, thanks for having me, Stephen. Great to be here with you and Daniel.
Yeah, I think I was just mentioning how we've met in person once. I think I got less than 30 seconds with you because you had literally a group of people around you, and including the person that I was talking to that just like midstream was like, I gotta go talk to Brian.
Well, so give that person some grief, but I'm pretty sure that yes, he grabbed me and dragged me away. So yeah.
Yep. So I will bust his I'll bust his chops next time I see him. But we're super excited to have you on. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Data is kind of at the core of most of it, if not all of it. And we love to nerd out on data. So we're super excited. If you've listened to the show before, you may know that we have a few traditions, a few rituals. The first of which is what we call Good News Stories. It is a work or personal related story from the last couple of weeks. Each of us will share, and we like for our guests to go first. So
you got it. Let's give it a shot. So last couple of weeks, I've actually been back and forth to New York City twice. Had a really great time, both personally as well as professionally. But the reason why it was great is I just had so much interaction with a bunch of human-centered leaders, folks that have been on your guys' podcast before. Annie Dean, Mel Rosenwasser from Atlassian hosted a dinner. I got to see her and Allison for a while. The Charter team, Kevin Delaney and Aaron Grau, just people I love spending time with. And just the opportunity to have meals together with folks like that is always just like, it revs my engines. It gets me going in terms of, I think people who have sort of similar thought patterns about, what we need to do to build a better future of work for people. And it's just great being with them. And so that combo of like personal/professional joy is just wonderful for me.
We actually missed you by a week. So we were there the week before, and I think Mel had let us know about the dinner. She was like, if y'all want to come back, but it's always a tough sell with, at least with my wife, like, hey, I'm going to go to New York again.
Yeah. But mine was insane because I was in New York. I came home for the weekend and then went back to New York.
Wow.
That's a lot. And I'll actually go next because my good news is actually Annie Dean related as well. So we had coffee with her when we were in New York, and she was like going deep on nerding out on how she's, playing around with Operator, or the fact that Operator had even been released.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. And so when I got back last week, I immediately started doing a lot of research, watching a lot of YouTube videos. And on Friday, I carved out like 2 or 3 hours to experiment. So I signed up for the $200 version of ChatGPT. Yeah. I started playing with Operator. I started playing with Deep Research. And I feel like there were some use cases that felt really helpful, but I still feel like it's in the phase where, it's in beta, but yeah, I feel like it's not like quite as advanced as I was hoping. Like I was hoping that I could go in there and create like all of these like really complex workflows and connect it to every tool that I have. And I feel like that's the future, and we'll get that in 6 to 12 months. But it was just fun I hadn't really set aside time for learning in like the last like 6 months. Like a lot of it was just like on the job learning. And this was the first afternoon that I set aside like 2 or 3 hours just to like play. And so,
it's not just the tools, it's you're playing around with the tools.
That's exactly. Cool. Yeah.
That coffee with, first of all, Annie is just such a chill person, but she's also so smart, definitely smarter, than me. I won't speak for Daniel, but
me as well.
We were just sitting there like, oh my God, just in awe. And then like, I think it was 2 days after the release of Operator and Deep Research, or whatever release those are part of. And Daniel and I were sitting there listening to her because we're pretty up to speed on AI. It's ingrained in everything we do. And we were like, how can we feel out of touch? Like, what is she talking about? And then we realized we were so busy in New York, we hadn't even noticed that this new release was out. So I haven't had enough time yet to go and play, but I'm looking forward to it. Kind of bummed based on Daniel's opinion, but I'll form my own, and maybe we'll talk about it.
It's awesome. Like, don't get me wrong. It's really cool, but like for some of the things that we wanted to build out for our company, just like aren't possible yet. but I think it'll get there.
Operator's cool. Deep research is mind blowing.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you start realizing what these things could do, which is good and scary.
Very scary. Well, but so we don't like send us all down a kind of deep dark path. I'm going to go a different direction with my good news. I'll give two, work and personal. I'll start with personal. My daughter turned 13, officially a teenager, last Thursday, and it happened on a weekend. I co-parent, so it happened on a weekend that I had the girls, which doesn't happen all the time. And I survived 6 13-year-olds screaming their heads off until about 2 a.m. Sorry, parents. I don't think any of y'all listen to the show, but yeah, it's quite the thing having the sleepovers at this age. I was not prepared. Our older daughter, like totally different. And so very interesting, but I survived. My second kind of work, personal related good news is but similar to your share, Brian, and that is I caught up with an old colleague of mine, a good friend, and I hadn't seen him. His name's Chris Kim. He's the global head of benefits at KKR. We worked at Goldman together for 5 years. And there's just something about meeting someone who knows you from that, like your early 20s, like that era of your career, and reconnecting and still just being, we're still cut from the same mold. Like we're still, we're friends, we're colleagues, like we know each other really well. And just having dinner and hanging out, it just was such a joy. And like, that was one of my big personal goals for 2024 was having more meaningful connections with people and in my personal life. And Chris was one of the people that I had reconnected. So cool to be able to have dinner in Austin last Friday with him. So
that's very cool.
That's fun. I mean, you've been talking about Chris for like 6 months and how you wanted to reconnect with him. So I'm glad you did that.
Yeah, check.
You found it.
And so, Brian, we've both been following you on LinkedIn for, I don't know, years now. And you and Nick Bloom are kind of like my go-to resources for all things remote work, all things future of work. And I think it was maybe like a month ago, you had posted about a couple of different things, and I was like, I need to reach out. Like me and Steven have talked about having Brian on the show for a while, but honestly didn't think that you would say yes. So I'm glad that we shot our shot. And so absolutely. I know like the LinkedIn version of Brian, but I'd love to learn more about you as a person and the journey that led you to becoming like the Brian that we see on LinkedIn that's posting about all this stuff. We've spent years talking with HR leaders, and one common theme that keeps coming up over and over again is our HR tech stack isn't actually making work easier. And if it is, it still feels like people are drowning in manual processes, disconnected systems, and not enough time for the actual work that really matters. And that's why we're really excited to announce that we're hosting a live session or webinar, whatever you want to call it, with ChartHop CEO Ian White on February 27th. He's spent, so long, years and years, thinking about how HR tech should work, and more importantly, how to fix the mess that so many teams are stuck in. And so in this session, we're going to cover real stories of the biggest time wasters and why they keep happening, why most HR tech stacks are working against you and not for you, and what the best HR tech looks like. This session is open to everyone, and we're going to send the recording to anybody that registers, even if you can't make it live. So if you want to join us, go to the link in the show notes and go save your spot right now.
Yeah, so journey starts off in southern Illinois, middle of nowhere, a town called Taylorville. My mom was a single mom, raising me and then my younger brother at a time when single moms were a little bit more rare. Like I was the only one in my town growing up that I was aware of. So a bit of an oddity right there. And then I was also a geek, reader, science fiction, all that, but also a data geek. And I kind of carried that through. So got my undergrad in math, mathematics. Ooh, exciting. But actually used that in social sciences, like this bunch of applications on that front. But also had a side gig. I was talking to somebody over the weekend about this. My side gig when I was in college was stage manager for musical theater. Loved putting on a show and watching people's reactions. But the data geek won out in terms of getting paid. So as a consultant for a number of years, but then got really kind of tired of the whole like, let me do a presentation for you and put a PowerPoint on a shelf someplace, and really wanted to get my hands dirty as an operator. So in the late 90s, I jumped out into Web 1.0 bubble and went into tech, ended up being CEO a couple of times of startups. Nothing ever died. Nothing ever did stratospherically well. But all of that was like a great learning experience. But what I learned was the whole phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast was super true. Like my ability to align, engage people from different backgrounds, with different perspectives was going to be the key to whether we were successful or not whether I had the right strategy or the right analytics behind it. And that was there was a few years there where I basically sucked entirely at being a decent leader. But I learned sort of the school of hard knocks and some people coaching me along the way. And the way that wraps back to today is I've kind of combined two things, post that another couple of decades, leading and building software startups and companies and working at Google and working at Slack, leading product and engineering teams, but also that deep kind of data geek inside of me. What I try to do these days is blend the two together. Like, what does the research tell us are better ways of helping people be efficient and productive at work, combined with stories from people like Mel, from Annie, from others who are getting it right when it comes to how we work, not just where we work. And so that's kind of my beat and my riff. It's like, what's people leadership look like, and how do we support that with science, but also storytelling?
And so,
Go for it, Stephen.
yeah, no, I was going to say like because I didn't know any of that. And outside of having stalked your LinkedIn profile prior to the call, like we do with every guest. And so I'm curious, like at what point, where was the launching point for the future of work? Like,
Yeah.
and that was an important time because we were born out of that. Like I think the week that we went into stay-at-home orders was the week like Daniel called me and was like, I think I made a terrible mistake, just because he had recently changed jobs. And I was like, dude, you didn't. You made the right mistake. And he was like, and also I think this is crazy. Like we should document and capture what's going on. So did something similar like that happen to you?
Yeah, so I was at Slack and I was leading our developer platform team in March of 2020, like dial your head back almost exactly 5 years now, right? And we were just as office centric as everybody else, even though people assume Slack is this happy, friendly, remote first organization. We were not back then. And we were going through the same challenges everybody else was, but also we were having a bunch of conversations with executives at other firms. How are you handling this? How are your people doing? Are you changing your policies going forward? And I actually took the opportunity, because I'd been moving some of the stuff I was working on off to other people, to go to Stuart Butterfield, who was Slack's CEO, with a proposal on something that I knew he wanted to do, which is have a think tank on the future of work that was associated with Slack. And I grabbed two amazing, fantastic people, Sheila and Helen, who were my co-founders on Future Forum, who I knew pretty well, but hadn't worked with as much directly, and kind of convinced them to take a swing at this thing with me. And dial your head back, maybe this must have been like April or May of 2020. Everybody was still thinking that maybe this whole pandemic thing will blow over in the next couple of months and we're all going back into the office. So we stood up Future Forum, which was a think tank. We started up the research with Christina Janzer and the team at Slack, who ran the research side. And it just did fantastically well. Like we had good, high quality, independent research. We were tracking trends over the next 3 years about what was working and what wasn't and for whom. And we were willing to talk about stuff that a lot of corporate leaders weren't, like, hey, these flexible ways of working are actually better for women than they are for men. They help out Black and Hispanic employees in ways that don't necessarily get seen by white employees. Stuff that might have felt uncomfortable to others that we were just willing to wade into. So we had a blast doing it. But that starting point was back in that same spot, which is March 2020. The world sort of is turning upside down. What are we doing about it? What insights can we bring? And we'll see how much changes.
And so fast forward 5 years, I think that's a great way to kind of frame up the conversation today. And I want to talk about the headlines today versus then, and really have a conversation about what the reality is, because I'm not sure those two things are exactly aligned, what we're seeing and what is actually happening. And as Daniel mentioned, there are not a lot of great sources for data on this topic. And so we're super excited to dig into this with you. And so if we were to just go off the news and social media, you would think that remote working is dead.
Yeah.
You only the companies that are prepared to fail and or not be competitive are the ones going remote. But we know because we're privy to data, like all the off the record conversations we have, that's not exactly the case.
Yeah.
And so walk us through what your data is showing, and let's talk a little bit about how the headlines have changed today versus 5 years ago. Anything you can share there would be great.
Yeah, glad to do it. So when we were running the Future Forum work, we actually tracked every single quarter 10,000 people's preferences and what they were doing. After a couple of years, honestly, it got boring because the preferences fell out on the same distribution like continually.
Mm-hmm.
There's about 15% of people that wanted something fully remote, about 20% that wanted full time in the office. Most people want some regular time together with their team that sits in the middle, where that time together might be once a month, might be once a quarter, might be 2 or 3 days a week. It depends on how your team is set up. The headlines for 5 freaking years now have been remote work is over, flexibility is doomed, we're heading back to the office, because the headlines get written about a CEO who's decided to make a change, to go back into the office, right? There's not a lot of headlines that get written about we didn't change our minds, because that's a boring headline. No one would ever read the story. If you look at the data underneath it, yes, it's gotten a lot noisier over the course of the past 6 months. Andy Jassy at Amazon, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, Donald Trump. But 68% of companies in the US have some sort of workplace flexibility. That's FlexIndex. FlexIndex tracks roughly 8,000 US-based firms. That number didn't change last year. Like last year, Q2, Q3, Q4 numbers were all pretty much exactly the same. In fact, Q4 went from 67% flexibility to 68, like no change. If you look at Nick Bloom's data on percentage of people working from home or US Census data, Nick's phrase is flat as a pancake. Like we're at a point where about a quarter of all workers, meaning frontline and knowledge workers, work at home for at least a few days a week. And that hasn't changed much for the past couple of years either. There is a little bit of migration in the world, though, and that's more towards some sort of like, hey, 3 days a week is really the number and we really mean it. You're seeing that from more companies, and there's some shift towards that. It's not far off of what the average person wants, so it's not horrible. But I think what you're going to see is this battle between how far are people really willing to go on the 5-day-a-week return to office mantra, when the reality is for every CEO who does it, there's 2 others that look at that and go, cool, you do you, and I will pick off your top talent because I know that I can use this as an opportunity to cherry pick some people away from you.
Yeah, like the Atlassians of the world. I mean,
Exactly.
it sounds like that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, they've advertised it, right? Amazon announces 5 days, and Atlassian comes out with something like a day later going, congrats, here are literally, several hundred job openings. Anybody want to switch?
Yeah, I can't remember if I think it was Roz Francis Harris, the VP of Talent Acquisition at Zillow. When we had her on the show, she walked us through the funnel metrics, like pre-COVID versus post-COVID, where they went fully, I think they call it Cloud HQ, and like it wasn't even comparable. Like the amount of inbound that you get whenever you have a fully remote role or a flexible role just doesn't even compare.
Well, and this is the thing that a lot of CEOs miss is you've actually got real advantages, right? And some people do get this, which is I can attract talent from more locations. It's the reason why we changed it at Slack. We talked about it for years beforehand about standing up a remote team, right? But because we'd never done it before, we didn't trust that we could do it. We were 3 months into the pandemic, and Cal Henderson, our CTO, is the one that said, hey, I've changed my mind. We can now hire people that aren't just willing to move to San Francisco and New York and Melbourne and Dublin. I can hire people in a wider range of geographies, and that gives me access to more talent in more places. It's also a little bit cheaper. So why wouldn't I?
Yeah, it's crazy the days when there was like a belief that you could only find talent in certain cities, whether it was New York or the Bay Area or Austin. And my eyes were opened. I like bought into that.
I took the bus back and forth. It's a glorious luxury bus. I took the bus back and forth from San Francisco to Google headquarters in Mountain View every day for 5 years.
Wow.
That bus ride sometimes was an hour each way, sometimes it was 2 hours each way. There's no way you could convince me for any amount of money to do that again. The drain on your lifestyle, the challenges of doing that are just too much.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of leads me to the next question, which is, it feels like these RTO mandates are a way for some companies to do these stealth layoffs. And I can't remember which of your newsletter posts that I was reading, but you outlined how there are, out of the companies that have done these RTO mandates, there's almost like three buckets. There's the bucket that actually think going back to office is going to make employees more productive or more efficient or whatever it is that they're trying to optimize for. The second group is are the companies that have just like huge real estate investments they can't get out of. And so they're like, just come back to the office. Like, we need to make the most of it since we're paying for it. And then the last one being the stealth layoffs.
Yeah.
And again, like, there aren't, at least to my knowledge, many resources where I can go find this data immediately. And so just
Yeah.
out of curiosity, like, do you have any data, or do you have access to any data that's saying, like, what percentage of those companies are doing stealth layoffs versus actually believe this is the right move?
Yeah, it's hard to define, in part because all three of those can overlap in the same company.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So how you attribute it and what it is. I'll take the easiest one first, which is stealth layoffs. The attribution there is pretty straightforward. If the firm has done a major round of layoffs, and then, within the same span of time, maybe a week or a month, they also say, by the way, we've changed our remote working policy and we're getting much more stringent. It's a soft layoff, right? And the people, like, I've actually done this with big tech. If you take the big tech companies and you look at the ones that had the highest percentage of their employees laid off, they're also the ones that had the biggest shift in policy. So number one, with a bullet, Dell, right? Dell laid off 12% of its workforce in 2023, another sizable portion in 2024, and they progressively got more and more strict. The wild part about this is Michael Dell went to Congress and testified about the benefits of hybrid work before the pandemic. Okay. Kate Lister, shout out to Kate, who's done this work for years, also went to Congress to testify about the benefits of what the federal government calls telework. You can access cheaper talent. You can get them from more places. They're highly productive. You can manage them. Michael Dell did this. He's now changed his mind. He's not changed his mind, I don't think, because of his fundamental beliefs that hybrid work or flexible work doesn't work. So we can all sort of track that one. Real estate is often a factor. It's not always the biggest factor and necessarily the driver. But if you work in a financial services company that's building out $1 billion headquarters and that has major substantial stakes in the commercial real estate industry, you should not be surprised when your CEO says, I want people back in the office, right? So that one definitely is a factor. The other factor on that one is companies have tax incentives from cities and municipalities and obligations on that front that are worth money to them to drive it back. The first one that you mentioned, though, which is, I believe that we're better this way, is often literally that way. It's not necessarily that they know that there's a problem, it's they feel that there's a problem. And sometimes, we should get into this, sometimes those two things are actually related. But as often as not, especially in the chief human resource officers I've been hearing from in the past month or so, it's more in the realm of a CEO who feels like, I wasn't happy when we agreed to 3 days a week being the policy, but I did it. And now I'm only getting 2. And I'm unhappy because people aren't doing what I told them to do. And that's what's applying some of the pressure these days, not necessarily an actual performance problem, but a feeling like, I'm being cheated. The problem is the word that's missing in all that conversation is trust. It basically is, as a CEO, I don't trust that people are working hard enough when they're working from home. And so therefore, I want to push them to come back into the office. The problem with that, of course, is that you then tar everybody with the same brush. So maybe you get a few people who aren't working very hard to work harder, but the ones who are working their butts off also are getting that same thing applied to them. And what's going to happen on that end is they stop trusting you because they feel like you're monitoring them. And it's back to Spotify's CHRO's line about, if we hire adults, let's treat them as adults, not children.
So you gave us permission to go off script.
Do it.
And we told you we gladly would accept that offer. And so this is where I'm going to start that. And I want to talk about a fourth dimension, which feels like it could be related to some of the three scenarios that we just talked about, and that is politics. How
Yeah.
much, and I'll start by describing a phenomenon that we have observed on the HR side of things. And then we can open it up to talk about how, if that relates at all to return to office.
Yeah.
It was around summertime 2024 and that topics started to come up. And because we're a content business, meaning everything begins and ends with the podcast. We do a lot of other things now, but it all begins and ends with the podcast. And so we started to notice like a trend, and some of it was like our content that was going viral, and some of it was just the way that other content was going viral as well. And I've called it the politicization. Sorry, I can't say that word, of HR. And everything seems politicized.
Yes.
And we have a marketing thesis, because we're also like a marketing agency. We have a thesis around why it's happening on the content side. But when I just couldn't help but think about politics when, just observing the last 10 minutes of this conversation, like all of these, the real estate point, politics, like there are communities that are served by these office buildings and the micro economies or sub economies that are created from working in the office. And when you no longer do that, there's an impact. So I'll stop. I won't, I think you get where I'm going. And so how much, if at all, does politics play into these things?
Absolutely. So I'll give you the specific concrete ones, which is big city mayors have been pushing really hard, including Muriel Bowser in DC, for a return to office, right? Because it impacts their tax base. It impacts, work from a downtown central business district perspective. Now, Muriel Bowser in DC, in her inaugural speech, said, get the federal workers back. But she also then continued the sentence, or turn them over to local government and local nonprofits who actually need space. We will then utilize them, right? So there's multiple ways to get at this. But that political pressure has absolutely been there. It's been there in the Fed workforce now for the past several years, because you've got Democratic mayors, right, pushing on the Biden administration. You had, unfortunately, a number of Republicans who would demonize this in order to demonize a workforce. I'm sorry, we would have demonized the federal workforce for being lazy and shiftless if they were working in the office just as much as we're going to demonize them for being lazy and shiftless if they were working from home. They are dedicated civil servants. I'll get off my soapbox. But the federal workforce stuff is the most obvious, glaring example of politicization going on. It happens more broadly, though, too, right? And the way that it happens and the way that starts to show up is some of the pressure here is around a return to hustle culture. And the return to hustle culture, the symbology, the signs that Johnny shows up early, Johnny stays late, therefore we should reward Johnny, more often than not go to people who look and operate like me. And trust me, I did it really well for a number of decades because I was the primary caregiver at home. But that's why this starts to feel political for people in real ways also, because Mark Ma's got, by the way, a bit of research on this. It's not surprising at all that the CEOs who push this most often are almost always white men. So the system works really well for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The other thing that came up for me hearing kind of you all talk through the last segment was during the pandemic, like the peak pandemic, Daniel and I had just launched the show. I think we may have done like a one-on-one riff on this topic. And it was just like, we call it Weretonomics, these ideas we have that are not rooted in data. So we should not be standing behind, but some of them we feel pretty convicted about. And one of which was this belief that I had that we were entering like a dual labor economy, in which there's a subsection of the US workforce, maybe the global workforce, that legitimately wants to work in the office. And it's just personal preference. It just may be work style, like whatever goes into that. And then there's another subsection of the workforce that wants to work remotely. And what I thought was happening was we were seeing the emergence of two distinct workforces that would have different talent acquisition strategies, talent employee experience strategies. Like everything would be different. And we were mainly speaking from the remote working perspective because
Yeah.
we had these people like Darren Murph, people like Shelby Wolpa that came on our show and described what is involved to create a truly digital remote first culture. And we were blown away by this. And it was
Yeah.
like, wow. And even talked about companies like Atlassian, like potentially achieving escape velocity as it relates to attracting talent in a remote environment, because they're going to be so far ahead of what everyone else is doing. And it's interesting that we talked about them earlier. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, how does this sit with you? Does it sit at all? Is it all just BS? Worthonomics? Like, share,
Yeah,
please.
I think the challenge is like there's not that many people that sit on the far extremes, right? So you do have people that want to be full time in the office, partly just because home setup doesn't work for them, right? Like I had a team working for me in India in spring of 2020. Their situation working from home was pretty horrible. They were tethering off of phones for internet connection, multi-generational families in small apartments, just a rough setup. You have people where it's just a personal preference, right? I like to have that physical separation of where I work and where my home is. I want the commute because it gives me a break and I dial out of work. And by the time I'm home, I'm me again. Maybe a little Severance right in there, by the way, reference. Most people want something in the middle, though, and most teams want something in the middle. And that's where it gets tricky and gets to where you need to think more about design. The other thing is, like, we got to stop centering the office as being the be all end all. There's a critical role that shared time together plays in team formation and relationship development and going deeper with people. And that's something that companies have to invest behind. You have to give people both space and travel funds and things like that to be able to do it. But I think most people and most firms are going to find their way towards something that fits in the middle, that happens at a layer down from the CEO's decision making authority, which is what's the right answer for a group of junior salespeople who are regionally co-located in the same office is going to be different from a product development team that's spread out across North America. It just is, because the habits and patterns and rhythms work differently. How you learn is different. What their own preferences look like and how you center that team is going to be different. So I think what we're facing here is, in the same way that no one team uses email in exactly the same way or Slack or anything else like that, you're going to end up with what's the role of the office being a tool, not the entirety of the structure for how we make our decisions about work.
Yeah. I want to go back to something that you said when you were describing how politics plays into some of these decisions. And you said that what you've seen happen is that CEOs, usually white males, have this feeling of being cheated by their employees, and they
Yeah.
want to. What did you say? That there's pressure to return to this like return to hustle culture,
Yeah.
and they want. Usually, what happens is they go to their HR leader, and they say, "We need to go back to the office," and
Yeah.
then we talk to the HR leaders, and they're like, "I don't know what to do. Like, I
Yeah.
can't. I need to have like a compelling argument for why we shouldn't do this, but it's hard to have these conversations in a way that's not going to potentially make me like either like lose my job or I don't know, like there's a lot of ways that it could go bad. And so I really enjoyed the article that you wrote recently on how to handle, I think it was called like your CEO wants to RTO,
Yeah.
and you outline how you can push back and you give a good list of questions that you should be asking as the leadership team.
Yeah.
So, what advice do you have for all of the HR leaders listening that are maybe experiencing this right now?
Yeah. The first is, it can be challenging with the CEO, and trust me, I know, to actually push back on them. Data can help, meaning even having the conversation we had at the start that says, hey, look, just so you understand, not the headlines are full of people who are doing this, but not everybody is doing it, including not everybody in our industry. So knowing and understanding even in your own industry, who isn't doing this, because your competition also sets the tone for your talent in terms of what you're going to be able to do and not do and get away with. Then there's a set of questions you can ask. The biggest one actually first is, what problem are we trying to solve? Like, what underlying issue really is going on? And do we have any data to say that it is an issue? So I have had this happen where we've got into the internal data of a company and figured out, hey, look, our junior salespeople really are struggling, right? And we've got data that shows that our junior salespeople who are fully remote are struggling more than the ones who are in the office at least a few days a week. And so we need to actually address that and deal with it. But then you've got a specific problem to fix, and something that you can do with it. More broadly, the issue is, I think a lot of CEOs and even a lot of other senior leaders see this as, hey, can't we just put a quick fix in here and we're going to state a new policy and then we're going to move on? When we all know that that's not going to necessarily solve, the broader sets of issues that are going on. So the other questions go to work design, pretty much, which is, are your teams distributed or are they co-located? So if everybody was on teams where everybody is co-located, the manager and all the team in the same city, then saying be in the office 5 days a week can make sense. If you look at where Amazon gets the most resistance, it's from the broad number of people at Amazon that work on teams that are spread out across locations. So if what you're saying to people is commute in the office 5 days a week, but I'm on a team that's distributed across locations, you're cutting into my commute time. The commute time's cutting into my collaboration time. Sorry. If I'm on the West Coast, I've lost time with my East Coast counterparts. The second question on terms of that work structure is, how are teams structured in the first place? Am I primarily on a dedicated function like a junior sales team? Or am I every 6 months changing the rotation of what project I'm staffed on, right? And if it's projects based, maybe you should be thinking about, how do I get those project teams together for kickoffs, for going deeper with each other, for milestone reviews, and for work like that. The rest of this basically goes to, what's my employee value proposition? Because that comes back to that issue of trust. If I really am a nose to the grindstone, live to work for this company, and that's what you feel like you've lost over the course of the pandemic, then maybe this is your answer. Meaning, when Amazon says culture, they don't mean warm and fuzzy. They mean Amazon's pretty hardcore culture, which it has been for decades. And so you may be reinstilling that, but then the question becomes, who are you going to lose along the way in doing that? Who's going to decide that that's not for them any longer? And the last one is, are you sure that you, boss, the CEO, should be the one making this unitary decision? Given all those issues of co-location versus distribution, given how different teams are structured, given who's going to be impacted in what areas, because the moment you, CEO, make a decision that this is the answer, every leader south of you then has a wrestling match with their team about the exceptions, about what's best for certain teams, about whether we're going to give people who are highly talented who could go someplace else a free ride on this and let them, quote unquote, cheat the system. The cascading effect on this is not very good. So that's the logic I try to help people with is what can you take to your CEO to get them thinking about, I may not like it, but this is more complex of a challenge than one that I think I should be applying a single simple answer to.
One more question that I think that I would add if I were a leader is asking the CEO, is going back into the office going to help us with AI? Like, is this going to set the company up to really like hit the ground running on the AI front? And I feel like that's a pretty eye-opening question for leaders, because and this isn't something that was a realization of mine. This was actually from a conversation we had with Annie Dean at that coffee. Yeah. She was like, these RTOs, they're contradicting what CEOs are also asking. If you're asking your company to figure out AI, but also telling them to go back to the office, like those two things don't go together, because you need all of the transcripts, you need all the recordings, you need all the documentation, you need all the Slack conversations, you need all of the stuff in the calendar invites and all of the digital touch points. What are your thoughts on that? Is this something that you've also been digging into? The more that I think about it, the more I realize that for AI to actually be useful, almost all of work needs to happen digitally. And I actually had this realization when we were grabbing coffee with Annie Dean, who is the VP of Team Anywhere at Atlassian. We were talking about RTO mandates, how companies are pushing for people to come back into the office, but at the same time, they want to adopt AI and they want to work more efficiently. But these two things don't really go together. She pointed out that AI is only as good as the information that it has access to. So if your team's knowledge is scattered across random email threads, sticky notes, and conversations that never get documented, AI can't help. But when everything lives digitally, like within a tool like Confluence, AI can really become a game changer. And that's exactly what Atlassian's new free guide to AI powered knowledge management is all about. It breaks down how AI can help teams organize, share, and find information effortlessly. This guide lays out real ways that AI can make work faster, easier, and more connected. So if you want to grab a free copy, just click the link in the show notes.
Yeah, it's spot on. Annie's great on this stuff because she's been playing with the tools and using them and also seeing what happens. It's kind of like when Michael Dell in his headline about everybody going back said that we need to get off of our reliance on email and back to in-person conversations, from a guy who not only sells servers that serve email, but also sells servers that actually support the AI economy, right? So kind of funny when you think about it. The bigger thread here, though, is if you can't figure out how to make flexible work and the transitions required for that, those are modest compared to the sort of redesign or re-architecture you need to do in your firm to really tap the power of these new AI tools and what's coming. There's also just some really common patterns between the two. I've worked with enough companies on both AI adoption as well as hybrid work to sort of see what these things are. And there's three of them that I'll give you that are pretty straightforward. One is you have to move to outcomes-driven management, meaning one of the biggest benefits you can have for allowing people to adopt flexible work is you move to something that says instead of the annual performance review and measuring people on the basis of who's showing up, we're going to measure people on the basis of quarterly deliverables. How are you doing quarter on quarter against the goals that we mutually set? That kind of outcomes base also really matters when it comes to generative AI. Because if I don't know what the goal is I'm going after, what I'm going to hear as an employee is I'm expendable because you're just after efficiency. On the other hand, if I can point to outcomes I'm trying to generate and we can go faster at them, then we both win, right? The business does better and I do better as an employee. The second big factor is you can't make these decisions at the organization level. You figure it out at the team level. How what the pattern is for getting people together in person on that product development team is different from that junior sales team. How a product development team uses AI is different from a sales team. You're going to have to get in there as a team and understand what are your agreements about how you use it, what are your norms for using it. And that brings us to the third, which is experimentation and iteration. You've got to be willing to put time and effort into building new muscles around this. The numbers are shocking on this one. It's like 25% of firms have put some degree of training program in place for generative AI, but almost every CEO wants to see it drive more efficiency. There's also only about 35% of managers who've been trained how to lead a distributed team, but the vast majority of them are leading a distributed team. So we want to get better, but we got to put the resources behind it. So outcomes-driven ways of working, team-centered ways of working, and experimentation and iteration and training are necessary for both of these. And what you do with one is going to help you with the other.
I'm glad the topic of measurement came up. One of the things I also love the article that Daniel's talking about. We'll provide a link to our listeners in the listener notes. You shared a quote, and you also mentioned it in the conversation a little earlier, that the vast majority of the views on productivity, and vast is my words, not yours, but I guess there's data that came out during the pandemic that I guess highlighted that there are situations where fully remote can be less productive.
Yeah.
However, and that is the often cited like data or research that a lot of companies or CEOs are making decisions or drawing conclusions about productivity in remote work. And one of the things, a huge caveat there though, is that this can be true if employees aren't being managed for performance.
That's right.
And that's a pretty major caveat, right? And so when I originally looked at this data, I was like, wow, okay, now I can start to understand how the pendulum shifted so quickly. Because Daniel and I talked about it. In fact, I think there's like we have an episode called Pendulum Shifting. And it was like CEOs or the powers that be had access to data that we didn't have access to. No one else had access to.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like how the behind the scenes works, because
Yeah.
you, I'm sure, have been engaged by companies or have been reached out to. And so I guess the first question is like, how does data play into the modern workplace? Like, how are data such as the research you are putting together and others, how does that drive these decisions that are being made?
Yeah.
And on the point specific to performance, I can relate to the CEOs because
Yeah.
having been a CEO and having worked at really large companies like Goldman Sachs and Ernst & Young, and knowing how performance management and performance ratings work at these companies, I think I would generally say it doesn't work well. And
Yeah.
it's not to say that people aren't being managed for performance, but I think CEOs will admit, like, we don't do that great. Like, we do it, and
Yeah.
HR runs that process, but we don't do that great. And so we've talked a lot about performance in this show. So I'm just curious your view on what do we need to do for performance management to be better, to really enable kind of the remote workplace of the future. Just curious if you have any thoughts there as well.
Yeah, tons. I've been in the same situation. I've been in a bunch of those conversations too. It's actually the fact that we don't trust or support our middle managers that's where a lot of this stuff falls down, right? Because a lot of CEOs rightfully think, look, most of my middle managers are probably getting by, right? They are people we promoted into the management job. Maybe we put some training into them. Maybe we didn't. Are they very good managers? Not really. And so they default back to management by walking around as being the thing, right? Like the fact that I can monitor people and make sure they're showing up at least is better than zero. Because I feel like if people are working from home, I've got zero. There's nothing going on. So, but anything is better than that first step, because if all I know is that someone is showing up, this is another one of my CHRO friends who said, when asked by their CEO, how do you know they're really working when they're at home? The answer was, or the question back was, how do you know they were working when they were in the office? Right? We weren't any better at this. We sucked at it equally well. What a lot of firms have had to do in order to address this is take the first big steps, which is how do we go to something that looks more like Google's OKR system or KPIs or MBOs or any of a litany of three-letter acronyms for ways in which we actually start articulating what are the goals and key results we expect out of teams, and then to the degree we can, take them down to individuals. Any system that we have around that inherently both sucks and is 1,000 times better than monitoring whether or not somebody's butt is sitting in a chair, right? It's just going to be better. So the act of actually having the conversation with a team that says every quarter, what are your goals? How are we going to measure success? And how are we going to see whether or not we're going in the right direction is a much better form of management than making it work at the annual performance appraisal process. The problem is we all know and understand that performance management in most places is a combination of science plus art, right? You can put a yardstick against certain jobs. You can put a yardstick against customer support. That's why it's really easy to measure customer support people and see how they're doing regardless of where they're located, because you can measure quality and customer feedback off of it. You can do it to some degree for sales. There's a lot of contributing factors about whether or not a salesperson hits their bogey. You can do it to some degree with some stats for engineering. But most jobs these days, most of the bigger, more complex jobs, are about cross-functional teams. They're about how you work as well as what you do individually. And so that does require judgment. But if you can start this process of saying, hey, look, I've got a team of people that are working on this project. Is it actually contributing the results that we expected coming out of it? If it is, if it's having impact, then I'm going to reward the people that are actually working on that project for what they're creating. But I'm also going to assess the quality of their work, right? That's what I have managers for, leaders for, is to assess the quality within a function. So you can build these systems. One of my favorite examples off of Wall Street is Synchrony Financial, where the CEO came out and said, we're not going back in the office full time because I've traded this off. I've traded off this combination of more flexibility for people with more sticking to results. There's a phrase, Eric Severson, who's Neiman Marcus Group's chief people officer. I'm going to digress for a second. Neiman Marcus got sold last December to Saks. They sold for a fantastic multiple, like higher than Nordstrom. And they attribute it to their ways of working, which is you get a lot more flexibility, but in return, we have a no excuses performance culture. Every quarter, every manager and individual contributor sits down and looks at a list of things. What are the things you're expected to accomplish this quarter? And we hold you to it. And it's just a much better way of creating a level playing field for people and drive up organizational outcomes than any of the monitoring stuff we're talking about, or relying on, God forbid, keystrokes on a keyboard.
It's so simple. Like it really is. Like when you think about it, like have a system of tracking the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and manage to those. And what did you say? Any system we have sucks, but it's 1,000 times better than managing who's in a chair.
Yeah.
One thing we used to do at Humu, the last company that I worked for, that I
Yeah.
really loved, is like we would have OKRs for the marketing team, but then each of us on the team would select like 3 big bodies of work that we were going to do that quarter that we thought was going to help us get closer to those bigger goals that we had for the marketing team. And then each month we would break down those 3 bodies of work into like the 5 most important things to do for that month. And if everybody was getting their 5 most important things done for that month, then they're more than likely going to get all of their work done for the quarter, and we were more than likely going to hit all of our numbers or goals or whatever was on the OKR list for marketing. We were probably going to hit, and it was so simple. And we were fully remote, and I feel like every team should have some sort of system like that. I feel like with engineers, they already have a lot of these systems in place because that's how they operate. But I don't know. Like I feel like when you think about it, it's super simple.
It is simple, but it's astonishingly hard for organizations to make this shift. It really is, because I've even done it myself in companies. It's hard work because you have to actually articulate goals. You have to get crisp about it. And the hardest thing is you have to align as a leadership team. You have to get really good as a leadership group at being able to not only say these are our goals, but this is our priorities among those goals. Because if you have 20 goals for every human in every team, you just described something, Daniel, that was much more like, here's the 5 things marketing needs to get done this quarter. Here's the 3 things I need to do to contribute to that. That is discipline. That is, how do I actually make cross-functional decisions that are hard decisions often for executives teams to make. So I don't discount how much effort has to go into it, having lived through the joys of putting those types of processes in place.
Oh, definitely. And so I know we're getting close to time, but the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the effect of RTOs on women. And this one hits close to home. I have a wife who's an engineer in a very male dominated field. I have a daughter on the way who's going to be born here in the next 3 months. Steven has 2 daughters. And so I like to bring up the stat that you've put out there that women are 3 times more likely to leave when they face RTO mandates. And so whenever I bring this up, I feel like I get some pushback where they're like, well, won't it just go back to how it was before COVID? Like, are these people that were even working before we went to a more flexible model? Like, what types of jobs are these? Like, why does it matter? And I feel like I have decent responses to those questions. And so I'm just curious, like, if you're at a dinner and somebody's challenging you on, the real effect on women in the workforce, like, what would be your response?
It's really easy. 90% of the time in the US, mom is the default parent. If you look at Census Bureau data, if you look at other things, even in our mostly dual income households, mom more than dad is the one that bears most of the burden for childcare. And what happens when you go from 2 days a week in the office to 5 days a week in the office is you sizably disrupt a bunch of things that people have set up that have changed dramatically over the past 5 years. So dial your head back in a couple of different ways. There's 2 changes that are pretty substantial. One is childcare costs and availability. It's just gotten much harder to find good, high quality childcare, and it's also gotten much more expensive. So this isn't about the fact that you don't have a kid in childcare necessarily, but it's like the hours you need because you got to cover a commute in both directions now as well. Second is all of a sudden people are being asked to literally pick up and move in some cases, right? If you look at Walmart, if you look at Amazon, if you look at some of these other firms, or the commute is too long, so I would have to move. And 60% of the US has a mortgage below 4%. Cost of housing has gone up dramatically in the past few years. So I know people who've not gone back to work 5 days a week at Amazon because it would literally be more expensive for them to do that than it would be to take a 20% pay cut and go
Yep.
someplace else because of the cost of housing and the cost of childcare added up. So it's economics as well in all of this. It also is. Look, we finally got to the point where we had like record employment for women with children under age 5. Walking backwards on that, just to go from 2 or 3 days a week in the office to 5 seems pretty ill-advised.
I mean, that all hit very close to home. Like we had to make a decision as a family. Do we move to a different city so that
Yeah.
my wife could take a promotion? It was the one
Yeah.
condition, and we ultimately decided not to because we have a 2.9% interest rate for our house. And if we were to uproot the family and move to another city, we're either looking at renting out our house for a loss or selling our house for a loss or renting and renting it out here in Austin and then renting out a new house in whatever city we moved to. Like none of them were good options. It was like a list of bad options, and so
Yeah.
just didn't make any sense. And sorry,
Yeah.
Stephen, I feel like you're about to chime in. No.
No, I was just going to say, literally, as we were preparing for this conversation, I read one of the sections and I was like, this made me think of Tori, your wife, Daniel. And he was like, yep.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. Your experience is not at all unique. Like the number of, especially, Amazon, Dell, other stories that I've heard that are pretty much exactly the same is pretty high.
And I'm going to squeeze in one last question. I have to ask this, seeing as this is your area of expertise. Like, let's fast forward 5-10 years. Let's just go through that thought exercise. Like, what are some of the predictions that you're going to make, Brian, when you look to the future, seeing as having access to the data and information you have access to? Like, what's the workplace going to look like?
Number one prediction is we're all going to look back 5 years from now and go, God, I can't believe we wasted that much time arguing over how many days a week somebody needed to be in the office. At least I hope we do, because I hope to God 5 years from now we're not still having this debate. But I suspect in some organizations we will, because it's literally generational in its tone in terms of who's pushing it the most. I do think we'll be at the place where the vast majority of companies will have some sort of flexibility in place, right? It's going to look more like something that sort of feels like hybrid 2 to 3 days a week in most firms, because that's what most people want. It's going to look like that because that's a way to attract talent and to have people feel like they got some social connection with people as well as getting the work done. And so I think we're gonna normalize somewhere around there. But the amount of chaos and churn and debate about this thing, unfortunately, is going to continue for a while. And you will see some ongoing push from a number of senior leaders who are like, no, I want people back in because it's a combination of more comfortable for me, and because to your point, Stephen, I don't trust my managers to be on top of the work. I think that's going to come the most at very large, big organizations, as opposed to, everybody born basically in the past 10 years has sort of a lot more flexibility because they have figured it out. They've been born that way. Even if it's not fully remote, they've at least got in their DNA, I know how to do some asynchronous as well as synchronous collaboration with my team.
Brian, can you go for 5 more minutes? Because I have one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
So I think Stephen maybe alluded to this earlier. There's an argument that RTO is actually better for the economy. More people commuting, more people buying gas. You're eating at your local spot close to your office. You're filling up the commercial real estate. And so, I guess question 1, what's your response to that? And then question 2, what do you think the redesigned world or cities will look like? Because I don't think this move or the shift to remote work is going away. In fact, I think this is just the beginning, and whatever the number's at now, I feel like it's going to go up by a ton here in the next 10 years. And so I feel like it's going to force, I guess my argument is,
I think if it's Atlassian, there's going to be someone who just connects everything perfectly. AI, remote working, asynchronous work, this new performance management model, and they're just going to get so far ahead that everyone's going to be like, holy shit. It's going to be like web 1.0 where they're like, okay, well, we got to go chase Amazon now because that clearly is the future. But that's just my take. Sorry.
There's literally dozens of those companies, right? There's the HubSpots of the world, and there's the Zillows of the world, and Atlassian, and Allstate, and literally dozens of people. Airbnb, we just did a piece with them the other day about what they're doing. Like, they're fantastic talent magnets, and they're focused on more important problems than how many days a week. To answer your question, though, Daniel, there are real challenges with central business districts, but the problem is the word central business district. Like, I live in San Francisco, I feel it because I see it. And the challenge is you've built these downtowns that are primarily for business. If you have neighborhoods and areas that are a mix of commercial, business, and residential, they've done pretty well. Look at Manhattan. Look at, Soho and Southern Manhattan versus Midtown. Midtown continues to struggle and be problematic. The other parts actually do quite well because you've got a mix of purposes going on. I think that sort of central business district and tax problem is very real because you had cities like San Francisco that based their tax rates and the income to the city to support essential services on that. The answer is not to shove everybody back in the office. It's to do what San Francisco has already started doing, which is start finding income sources and tax sources that aren't just how many bodies are occupying downtown business centers. We've started literally approving those as measures here in the city over the course of the past election in particular. And you'll see that in other places too. The cities have been a bit too dependent on sort of this one singular source of income. Most of the jobs, there are good arguments that there were jobs and people that were really displaced in the pandemic. That is absolutely true, and that was rough. The jobs, though, have not gone away. They moved. The jobs moved from downtown central business districts to neighborhoods and suburbs. In fact, there's decent evidence out of Goldman Sachs that both like the services economy and the retail economy did better because of more work from home, not worse. And no, I'm not going to take the bait on gas. We need to guzzle more gas just because we don't need to guzzle more gas. We could probably do the opposite. The savings to the climate of not commuting 5 days a week, whether it's mass transit or your own car, outweigh any gains economically, in my book.
Well, it sounds like I was on the right track with my argument. I wasn't as articulate in explaining everything that you just did, but I was getting there.
I was rambling myself on that one. So
no, I mean, that was great.
It was great.
Okay, so just a couple closing questions. Who do we need to have on the show next?
Two of the folks that I've caught up with over the past few weeks, Samantha Gadd. Samantha is out of New Zealand. She runs this group called Experience, that's employee experience or employee. Start that one over. Samantha Gadd out of New Zealand. She runs a group on employee experience that's fantastic. She's got an EX manifesto that I think y'all would love. I'll send you a link to it, but she is really great in terms of forward thinking on what it takes to build great employee experiences. And then Jessica Zwann, ZWANN, Built for People is her book. If y'all may have read it already or seen it. I got a chance to meet her in New York the other week and thought she was fantastic. And being a product manager myself for a couple of decades, I get this whole mantra of we need to start thinking about how do we treat work as a product? How do we start thinking about building employee experiences in the way that we would build customer experiences?
Well, definitely reach out to Samantha. We've had Jessica on the show before multiple times. And, she is actually part of her, Built for People operations as a product or HR, as a product, whatever you want to call it. We believe there's it's part of the central thesis to the future of work for the measurement and OKR reasons. So one of the issues in HR is we've never been great about aligning what we do in HR to the key objectives and goals of the company. And so there's almost we need a new operating system. And I believe that's the future personally. But
yeah. And people always ask me for years, what's the right type of person to put into a future of work leadership role? And I said a product manager, because it's the exact same skill set that you need to do that you need to build great consumer products.
Human design thinking. Yeah, I love it. Love it. So, that gets us, we could go on, but we know you have other things to do. We have one final tradition on the show. We call it one word or phrase close. So we all respond with a word or a few that as we, think about the last hour and change we share together, just a way to wrap things up. And again, we prefer for our guests to go first.
I'll use the word trust.
Ooh, love it. Daniel, I know you're ready.
Follow the data, not the headlines.
Oh, also great. I'm gonna go with I'm gonna go with two. My one word is optimistic. Like, this is the most optimistic I've been in a long time.
I needed
honestly.
this.
I did too. I did too. Well, on that note, I'm going to keep it with just that, optimistic. And Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We are persistent. And so this is a long time in the making for us, but you did not disappoint. And hopefully you'd be open to maybe doing this in the future with us.
I loved it. This has been great for me too, and hugely energizing. So I really appreciate it. Great conversation, y'all.
Thanks.
All righty.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
All right, y'all. We've got some big news, or maybe not big news. You may have heard about this already, but we are doing MPL Live in Boston on March 6th. We followed the data this time, and the data was telling us we needed to go to Boston, so we're going to Boston. It's a top 3 city for us follower-wise. We owe so much to the incredible HR leaders who have been with us from the start that happen to be from Boston. Shout out to the MPL legends like Katie Burke, Dina Upton, Jen Paxton, Adrian Barnard, Tracy Sponenberg. I mean, there are just so many. I feel like I'm leaving a bunch of folks out, but I think that just speaks to how deep the Boston people leader bench really is. So here's what you can expect. We're going to do a speed networking session. So 60 minutes to meet as many people as possible. And if you can remember the most people superpowers from the people that you meet, it'll definitely come in handy for you. And you'll find out more on why at the event. And then the main event is the live podcast. So shout out to Katie Burke for these recommendations. But so far we have 2 amazing speakers lined up. We have Carmel Galvin, who's the Chief People Officer at Klaviyo, and we have Linda Aiello, who's the Chief People and Culture Officer at DraftKings. It's going to be a fun night. It'll be about 4 hours. And if you're in Boston and you're still listening to this ad, I think this is your sign to go grab your ticket. We'll put a link in the show notes. But we've already sold a good amount of tickets, and we're going to cap it at some point. So I'd highly recommend you go grab your ticket right now. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Modern People Leader. We really, really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating. It would mean the world to us. And connect with us on LinkedIn. We want to know what you think about the show, and you can find links to both of our profiles in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and see you on the next episode.